I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about the upcoming presidential election and the foreign policy of each candidate, we have with us a really special treat today, one of the people that I know who understands these issues better than anyone. It's the eminent journalist and scholar, Peter Bergen. Peter is, of course, at the New America Foundation, where he's VP. He is a CNN national security analyst. And he's got a terrific podcast, which he's the host of, called In the Room with Peter Bergen, which you can listen to on Audible or on the Sirius XM app. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Andrew, thanks for having me.
Let's get right to it. We're just on the heels of two conventions. Americans were paying attention to both. What are the key foreign policy challenges that are going to face the next administration, whoever that administration might be?
Well, let's start with the big one, which is China. And, Xi Jinping has said that the People's Liberation Army needs to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. Well, that would be in Harris's first term or Trump's second term. And how would they respond to that, I think, is a good question for the debate. And it's a good question just generally, because Biden actually moved the needle on Taiwan, I think, quite a lot, because, as you know, Andrew, the previous approach has always been strategic ambiguity, which means, let's not tell the Chinese what we're going to do. But Biden has been very clear. He went on 60 Minutes and said, if Taiwan is invaded by China, we will, respond militarily.
Right. That's a big change.
That is a big change. And there's a lot of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden-Harris team on China. Rhetorically, of course, there's differences, but Biden kept the tariffs Trump had put on. Biden, in fact, has taken a more aggressive stance on things like AI and quantum computing. Any American exports that might be used by the Chinese military, he's banned them. The CHIPS Act, of course, which is $52 billion, is not nothing. Some of it coming to Arizona, where I teach, is designed to pull the chips that are 98% of the world's most important chips are made in Taiwan. They're designed to pull them back here. And a lot of chips, of course, are also made in China. So, the CHIPS Act, I think, is a continuation of sort of what the Trump administration called out, how China is rising to compete with us. And the Trump administration took a much more aggressive line on China than previous administrations had. So I think there's some continuity there. Obviously, on the debate stage, there's going to be a difference on immigration, but there's a big but here. The Biden administration doesn't really trumpet this, but because it would piss off the left wing of their party, but they have basically closed the border.
Absolutely.
The way they've closed the border is quite clever, which is they have said that if there are more than 2,500 asylum seekers a day, that they will close the border. Well, there's not been a day since Biden's been in office where there hasn't been at least 2,500 asylum seekers coming across. So on immigration, obviously Trump has this plan, which I think would be legally impossible and also logistically very hard to do, to deport, millions of people who are in the country, many of them who are working in the kinds of jobs that many Americans don't want to do. There are differences, but there's also a similarity that I think is worth underlining. And then obviously on Ukraine, NATO, that's probably the sharpest difference that we're going to see. I just reviewed H.R. McMaster's new book, which is excellent, and I'm going to have him on the podcast later in September. But this bromance with Putin is hard to understand, but it's very real. We're doing a Project 2025 podcast as well. We talked to John Negroponte and Sue Gordon. Both John Negroponte was the first director of national intelligence. Sue Gordon was his principal director later in the game. And Sue Gordon was astonished by Trump's embrace of Putin at Helsinki. It really was very damaging to morale in the intelligence community. And, on the campaign trail, as you know, Andrew, he's also said if a NATO country was sort of potentially attacked by Russia, he might not come to their aid. Withdrawing from NATO, which John Bolton says he wants to do and he will do in a second term, we'll see. Even if he doesn't formally withdraw from NATO, he can massively undercut it. If the commander-in-chief of the most important member of NATO says, I will not abide by Article 5 in certain circumstances, then what is the alliance for? That will be obviously a big difference. But I think also there is some similarities now in Ukraine in the sense that I thought it was interesting that the recent money that went to Ukraine was framed as a loan, not a gift. So I don't think there's appetite. The left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing have sort of merged from a foreign policy perspective. It's sort of neo-isolationist. And neither side wants to send tons of money.
The left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah, yes.
Let's talk about that for a second. There really are some differences, as you point out, between Biden, Harris, and Trump on Ukraine and NATO. Trump has said that, he can end it in a day when he's in office. Does Harris have a different point of view on this than Biden?
I don't know. It's a really good question. Phil Gordon, her national security advisor, is a very serious guy. He's written this book, Losing the Long Game, which is a very good, and basically it's a very skeptical view of, the subtitle says what it's about, the false promise of regime change in the Middle East. So, that's where he's at. If she wins, he said probably will become a national security advisor or take an important policy role in her administration. So, I think that's a little bit of a tea leaf that we can read. But I think she said, you follow this intensively, and I'll ask you the question. I don't think she said a lot of substance on any of this. At the convention, she threaded a pretty careful needle on Gaza or Israel, which is, she said, we're going to support them militarily up the wazoo, and and then at the same time, she said the Palestinians have a right to the state and self-determination.
And she was very successful with that line. She got maybe her largest amount of applause. A lot of people thought that was the best part of her speech, and also when she talked about lethality.
Right. She knows that the left wing of her party, and then particularly the younger members of the party, don't want to do the bear hug on Israel and are really angry about the Gaza war. And I think there are a lot of younger Democratic voters for whom this is really a motivating issue, and they would not have voted for Biden. But I do think tonally she's taking a different tone than Biden has. And it was interesting that she had a separate meeting with Netanyahu when he was in D.C. We don't know what was said exactly, but certainly her tone is different. And she's younger than Biden, and so she's probably more in touch with the younger voters in the Democratic Party, who are pretty pissed off about this, I think.
Yeah. And, back to Ukraine and NATO, just to answer your question, I have not seen a lot of substance out of the Harris campaign. Granted, this is a new campaign. They had to start all over. Clearly, this is something that people want to know. Certainly people inside the Beltway want to know. We're talking on August 29th, and tonight she's doing her first interview with Tim Waltz by her side with Dana Bash of CNN. So I can't imagine Dana's not going to ask her, what about Ukraine?
Yeah. What about Gaza? What about Ukraine? What about China? We'll see. She's trying to establish her credentials as a potential commander-in-chief. Well, she was vice president, so she's traveled around the world, and so that's something. But I think that, Trump was president, he was commander-in-chief, so it will be interesting for American voters. I don't know to what extent voters actually vote on that issue. They might vote if they think that somebody would be a terrible commander-in-chief and a danger to the world. And it's not top of mind, right? I think it's inflation, immigration, pocketbook issues, the stuff that we've been discussing just now. Most American voters, I think, other than maybe Gaza, I think is certainly a very emotional issue for swing voters in Michigan and other places.
And the immigration issue, as you point out, is a huge issue in this campaign. And another thing the Biden administration has done, in addition to trying to get a bipartisan deal in Congress, which was killed in part by former President Trump, but Biden administration also has changed some of the procedures. Like, there used to be a question asked at the border to the asylum seeker, are you afraid to go home? Which is a pretty leading question. And, most people who are trying to seek asylum would say, well, yeah, of course I'm afraid to go home.
Yeah, right. They know what to say.
Now it's not a simple question like that, because what would happen is they would say, yes, I'm afraid to go home. And then so they'd be in the United States for a couple of years while their case was being adjudicated. That's not the case anymore.
The immigration bill that you referred to, which was, a very conservative Republican senator from Oklahoma, I think Senator Langford.
Yeah.
And Senator Sinema, a Democrat from a border state, Arizona. This bill wasn't going to satisfy everybody. One of the key issues, there are only 650 immigration judges in this country, which is an astonishingly low number, given the fact there are millions of cases. I have a friend who is still in adjudication of his asylum case a decade later, and he actually works for the federal government.
That's incredible.
He's clearly not a risk. There's a very simple fix. You create more immigration judges, or you say that we don't even need a judge for this. We just need officials who are empowered to hear these cases in an expeditious way. Because, as you point out, people can their cases go on forever and they sort of disappear sometimes.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, let's say you have escaped the Taliban, which hundreds of thousands have. If you went back to your home country, you do have very good reason to be fearful. So, I mean, it's an asylum case. And look, and if you're fleeing Venezuela, Maduro is a terrible leader, and he just, fixed his election. And places dematerialized economically, in part also because of American sanctions have played a role, sort of amplifying the kind of terrible socialist rule of Maduro. So, I mean, a lot of those people are economic refugees who the asylum case may not be very legitimate, but a lot of them are completely legitimate because Maduro is running his police state and he's going around imprisoning and killing people that are in the opposition. So, yeah, I mean, the immigration issue will be an interesting one to hear.
Peter, do you have a sense of how Trump's foreign policy might be the same and different from his first term?
Great question. I mean, I've done 2 episodes. One is already aired on slices of the Project 2025. The first slice we took was the State Department, and we interviewed Kieran Skinner. Trump has tried to sort of say, I have nothing to do with Project 2025. I think mostly because it takes a very strong stance on abortion and being against it in any form. And I think that he knows that that's a political killer for him. So Kieran Skinner wrote the State Department section. It's only about 30 pages. And we talked to her and also a couple of very senior American diplomats retired. The theory of the case is that the State Department is sort of run by a bunch of pinko liberals who are just going to stand in the way of whatever President Trump, they don't mention him by name, they say a conservative president.
And these are the career people they're talking about. Yeah,
and it's a career, some person who's like devoted their career to Africa. I mean, you don't join the State Department to make tons of money. You go to help the American people sell goods or import goods or kind of get Americans out of trouble if they're, all the things that diplomats do. And then the same theory of the case in the intelligence community. That chapter was written by the chief of staff of Ratcliffe, who was the last ODNI, last director of national intelligence. Dussing Carmark wrote that chapter, and he wasn't available for an interview because he's working for a tech firm. But anyway, both the State Department chapter and the intelligence community chapter are predicated on the idea that there's sort of a fifth column of pinko liberals that will sabotage your efforts. And, the intelligence community, this is a particularly sensitive issue because you think about, when General Petraeus went over to the CIA, he took nobody with him. At the agency, doesn't particularly like a bunch of politicals coming in. Porter-Goss, you may recall, brought a bunch of people in, and they were kind of rejected by the building when he was CIA director. But so, intelligence, what's the point of the intelligence community? Is to tell the president things that he or she might not want to hear. That's their job.
And to have the institutional knowledge of, in many cases, decades of service to many different presidents.
Absolutely. You don't join the IC, the intelligence community, you're working long hours for relatively low pay, and these are often highly qualified experts on whatever subject. I mean, classic example of this is Barbara Sood, who's a PhD in Islamic theology from Princeton. She wrote the famous Presidential Daily Brief, which was briefed to George W. Bush in Texas on August 6, 2021. Bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. And as you said, this assessment wasn't like arrived at idly. It was a bunch of people who'd worked on the Al-Qaeda kind of case for years and years and years contributed to this Presidential Daily Brief because they thought it was important to flag to the president. So, Trump himself, on the subject of the intelligence community, when Dan Coats, who's a conservative senator from Indiana, became the director of national intelligence, when he publicly testified that Iran was keeping to the nuclear deal, the next day, or that day, Trump tweeted, time for, my intelligence crew to go back to school, at which point, basically you're done. But Coates obviously did the right thing. I mean, when he's testifying, he was testifying to Congress in that yearly threat assessment that all the leaders of the intelligence community give every year. He was just going to get the intelligence as it stands. Anyway, so this is a very bad idea. And it's actually equally bad ideas. I mean, what's the point of the State Department? State Department is also to tell the president kind of unvarnished things that he or she may not want to hear about Russia, Ukraine, whatever. I mean, so, and the intelligence community in the same way. Andrew, how long have you been in Washington?
My whole life.
Okay. I mean, I've been here 3 decades. I've spent plenty of time going to reporting on the intelligence community. The idea that these are a pinko liberal sort of fifth column is, kind of ludicrous on its face. I mean,
a lot of the people that I grew up with who their parents were that, and they would certainly object to it.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's a reason that so many Mormons are at the CIA. A, they speak languages, and B, they don't drink, and they've traveled around the world. And there are a lot of former Marines. And, the kind of people who get past the background check, and my wife used to work at DIA, it's like you have to be a pretty straight arrow to pass that test, to get in.
100%.
The whole thing is predicated on a false notion. But so answering your question, if this happens, and I think it's a huge if, because getting rid of career foreign service officers, I think there are going to be lots of legal challenges. There are unions involved. There are it's not something you can just snap your hands and just make it happen. But I do think that there is a serious plan on day one, if they're in a second Trump term, to get rid of a lot of the seniors, everybody above a certain level at the State Department, and make it all political, which, as you know, in the State Department, there are political appointees, but there are also career foreign service officers who are in some of those senior positions. I mean, an example right now is Bife, who's effectively the top official on the Middle East in the State Department. Well, she's a career foreign service officer. She's not a political. And so, our system, the American system, I think is kind of a good mix with, it is useful to have politicals, but if you have too many, you're not getting what you really need, which is unvarnished assessments of America's national security interests. And if you're just getting a kind of hallelujah chorus who just all singing your tune, I mean, going back to H.R. McMaster's book, I mean, H.R. McMaster, who was a 3-star general on active duty when he was appointed by his commander-in-chief to be national security advisor, saw it as his duty to tell the president things he didn't want to hear. And one of the things the president did not want to hear was that Putin doesn't have your back. Actually, he's a bad guy. In fact, he's a pathological liar.
And not only did he have HR telling him that, he had Fiona Hill, who probably knows more about Putin than anybody, telling him.
Well, she literally wrote the book on him. And Fiona Hill managed to stay longer, maybe because she didn't have to interact with Trump as much on a daily basis as HR did. But yeah, I mean, Fiona Hill is a good example of somebody who was a political appointee, interestingly, as far as I can recall.
She was.
Who's a subject matter expert. I mean, there's nothing to say that a very good friend of mine, Joel Rayburn, was the Syria envoy for Trump. I mean, and before that, he was a senior director on the NSC for Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Syria. And, Joel is an absolute expert on these subjects. It doesn't automatically mean, that a political appointee is going to be somebody who isn't a subject matter expert. But if you appoint a bunch of people who are political appointees in various agencies and they don't really know the underlying subject matter, I think that is a problem.
So that's going to be something to watch. Let's talk about Vice President Harris and how her foreign policy differs from Biden or doesn't differ from Biden.
I think it's very hard to decipher, Andrew. I just don't know. I mean, she has said that she was the last person in the room on the Afghan withdrawal decision. I mean, I don't think that's something to boast about, since I think that was one of the worst decisions of the Biden presidency. I think it's just very, very hard for us to decipher. We're going to get some answers before the election because of the public interviews and debates and things like that.
Yeah, right now we just don't know.
We don't know. And look, I mean, Biden was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades, it seems.
Which is the reason that Barack Obama picked him in the first place, because Barack Obama, then Senator Obama, didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience.
Well, that's right. And then he was vice president for 8 years, and then he was president for almost 4 years. So it's like, it would be surprising if somehow, she was absolutely integral to his decision making on foreign policy, because that's how he styles himself as his sort of area of expertise.
It's interesting, Peter, and I think you've alluded to this, is that the first Trump administration did shift some very important views on U.S. foreign policy, whether it's China or the issue of NATO spending. What do you think some of the surprising similarities between President Trump and President Biden's foreign policy are?
Well, I think we mentioned China, and I think there's a lot of continuity also on Israel. I mean, the background to October 7th is the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. Trump had ambassadors who were very much endorsing settler activity. Obviously, the Abraham Accords, which were sort of conducted above the heads of the Palestinian people. You may recall that there was a conference that Jared Kushner had where $50 billion was going to go to the Palestinians as part of this sort of deal in the Abraham Accords. And people came to this conference and nobody paid a dime. And the Palestinians didn't get anything out of this Abraham Accords. I mean, that's the context. And of course, if you go back to just before October 7th, you had Israeli cabinet official visiting Saudi Arabia. You had a Israeli official celebrate some Jewish ritual in Saudi Arabia, doing so, and I think posted on Twitter. I mean, there was Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, said publicly on Fox News in a very rare interview, we're very close to a deal with Israel. That was what he said. So on Israel, look, Trump is saying, I think, versions of, if you're Jewish and you're voting Democrat, you're not truly Jewish or something. I'm paraphrasing what he said. But I don't see a huge amount of daylight between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on this issue. And in fact, I think Trump was very pro Netanyahu. Netanyahu was sleeping in Jared Kushner's bedroom when they were
family friend. Yeah.
Family friend. So, I mean, there was Netanyahu is sort of occasionally dumping on Biden, which is kind of doesn't make a lot of sense because I think Biden's been giving him pretty much everything he wants.
Yep. And been friends with him for a long time too.
Yeah.
It's super interesting as we get closer to this debate on September 10th, which will air on ABC. So I want to ask you, Peter, if you had a question to ask each candidate during that debate, what would you ask Vice President Harris and what would you ask former President Donald Trump?
Take Trump first because it's easier. For the reason that he has a very long record
Sure.
in terms of public record.
And he's not shy about sharing his views.
Yeah, I would ask him, do you plan to get out of NATO?
Yeah.
On Harris, I'd say, what's your plan for Gaza? If a ceasefire agreement happens, the hostages are released. I mean, what's your real long-term day after plan that you think is realistic? Because I think if you go back to that speech that Biden gave several months ago, which I thought was a good speech about sort of a 3-part series of 6-week ceasefire leading to a rolling ceasefire potentially, and then the rebuilding of Gaza. So that seemed like a plausible plan. I mean, so I'd like to hear from her, what is the plan? Can you get the Saudis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis, A, to put money in, B, is there a role for, who's going to police Gaza? My impression is that Arab countries were very reluctant initially for a long time to sort of even contemplate getting involved in a sort of post-Gaza policing role, but it's going to need boots on the ground that aren't military, that are police, that can bring order. And where do those come from? So I would like some concrete ideas about what to do.
Let me follow up on that question, because I know you're talking to a lot of people about this issue of post-ceasefire, post-Hamas. What is security in Gaza? What are some of the best ideas that you're hearing?
Well, there's a discussion of the Palestinian Authority and them having some role. There's a discussion of, several thousand Palestinian police in Gaza that are there already that aren't associated with Hamas. I mean, I don't know how realistic any of this is, but I mean, it's going to be a giant reconstruction effort. I mean, to answer your question, I think that clearly there is discussion in the White House and elsewhere about what the day after should look like and what it might look like. The other thing also, UNRWA, if you don't have UNRWA in Gaza functioning, you don't have anything functioning in Gaza. They've run all the schools, they've run all the hospitals, they've run all the relief. Josh Rogan, who writes for the Washington Post, I think wrote a really good piece some months ago, pointing out, whatever you think of UNRWA, you also have to realize that without them, it's not going to function.
Right.
And if you take out UNRWA, you take out all the civil society that is functional. We've seen how that movie looks before. And, being a member of the Ba'athist Party in Iraq didn't mean you were a Ba'athist. You just had to be a Ba'athist for pretty much every important position. And we got rid of 30,000 Baathists and the whole place crashed. So UNRWA is a very different type of organization than that, but I think it's analogous. I mean, a society can't function without the people that have been making it function before. That is clearly part of the day after as well.
Interesting. Peter, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today. We've all learned a lot from hearing your views on these things. So thanks again.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.